Beneath the polished wooden pews of St. James Church in London, a different kind of scripture is whispered, one not written in holy books, but etched into rumor, memory, and silence. The faithful gathered here for centuries, lifting hymns toward heaven, while beneath their feet something older, darker, and infinitely more persistent waited. Generations of parishioners recall moments when the air seemed too heavy, when voices carried too clearly, when the echo of chanting seeped through the stone floor during sermons meant to exalt God alone. These were not the mistakes of imagination, they said, but the slow bleed of something concealed. In 1822, a weary sexton sweeping candle wax from the aisles swore he glimpsed firelight through a hairline crack in the floor near the altar. He leaned down, certain it was a trick of reflection, but the glow pulsed like a heartbeat, then vanished. He spoke of the vision in hushed tones, and though no entrance was ever found, history spread like a plague through the district. From that year onward, St. James ceased to be remembered as simply a sanctuary of faith. It became instead a house of shadows, a place where truth tangled with myth, and where the holy and the profane seemed locked in a silent duel. Theories quickly multiplied. Some whispered that the priests, custodians of God's mysteries, had hidden relics too perilous for ordinary eyes, relics said to bear curses instead of blessings. Others, bolder and more fearful still, claimed the vaults beneath the church were not storage at all, but prisons, holding souls so corrupted that even the earth refused them rest. And yet, the official histories remain blank. No architectural record, no parish account, no bishop's decree mentions chambers below St. James. Skeptics dismiss the tales as superstition born from candle smoke and echoing acoustics. But legends do not thrive without soil, and in London's mist, they grew roots. Faith demands light. Fear flourishes in shadow. That is the duality at the heart of St. James. To believe in the church is to believe in salvation, order, sanctity. To believe in its whispers is to confront the possibility that salvation was not enough, that beneath the altar, something required confinement. And this tension is what has preserved the story for centuries, priests preaching redemption above, while rumors of eternal damnation rustled below. The contrast is almost poetic, and it unsettles precisely because it resists conclusion. So we stand at the threshold centuries later, listening not to hymns but to questions. Were the vaults nothing more than Gothic invention, cobbled together by frightened minds in an age of superstition? Or did the church bury its most dangerous truths where no congregation would dare tread? Perhaps the answers still linger, sealed in stone, waiting like restless spirits for someone bold, or foolish enough to descend. Tonight, as we peer into the darkness beneath the altar, we ask not what faith built, but what faith chose to hide. The story of St. James Church cannot be told without returning to the London of the late 17th century, a city trembling between faith and fear. The Restoration had brought monarchs back to the throne, but it had not brought peace. Civil war, religious schisms, and the Great Plague of 1665 left Londoners desperate for order, for stability, for signs that heaven still looked kindly upon them. Churches were not merely houses of worship in this fragile landscape. They were fortresses against chaos, reminders that the city could rise again from pestilence and fire. Yet sometimes what rose from ruin was not only sanctity, but secrets. And so in the district where St. James now stands, foundations were laid not only upon stone, but upon the bones of the forgotten. The chosen site was already heavy with death. Before the church walls took shape, the ground had served as a burial pit for plague victims. The Black Death had swept across Europe in earlier centuries, but the Great Plague of London returned with merciless efficiency, filling the city's air with the stench of rot and despair. Entire families perished within days, their bodies dumped into hastily dug trenches. Chroniclers wrote of carts overflowing with corpses, of bells tolling endlessly, of streets where silence fell not from peace but from extinction. By the time carpenters began their work on St. James, the soil beneath their feet was a palimpsest of suffering. Every spadeful of earth disturbed human remains. Every foundation stone rested on the restless dead. The official record tells us little beyond the ordinary. Architects' notes describe the vaults below as crypts, intended for burials of prominent families and storage of church relics. Nothing extraordinary, nothing unholy, but folklore, passed mouth to mouth in taverns and whispered through pews, insists there was another purpose. Locals claimed priests conducted midnight rites in those same crypts, not to honor the deceased but to bind them. In this telling, the vaults were not storage rooms at all, but prisons, chambers built not to preserve faith but to contain whatever the plague pits had unleashed. Londoners in the 1600s lived close to death, and closer still to superstition. For them, plague was not only a disease but a visitation, a punishment, an opening through which dark forces might slip. When bodies piled faster than they could be consecrated, fears spread that the souls had not found rest, that they roamed, malignant, untethered. Exorcism was not exotic in such times. It was necessity. Priests were called to drive out the spirits of the fevered dead, to chant Latin over rotting flesh, to sprinkle holy water over pits where thousands had been lowered without rites. The belief lingered that some spirits could not be banished but only sealed, and so the tale grew. St. James was built not merely to glorify God, but to stand as a lid over hell's cracked jar. The contradiction between faith's shining image and secrecy's shadow deepened as decades passed. Parish accounts remain frustratingly silent, recording donations, repairs, sermons, but never naming the rituals locals swore they witnessed. Yet diaries from townsfolk hint at something stranger. One cobbler's journal, dated 1692, describes chanting heard past midnight when no service was called, and the smell of smoke issuing from beneath the altar. Another, penned by a grieving widow, tells of seeing a procession of priests descend with censers and return pale-faced, refusing explanation. None of these accounts appear in official archives, but together they sketch a picture of uneasy compromise, a church tasked not only with saving souls, but with burying secrets too volatile for daylight. By the early 1700s, the church had grown into its reputation. Children were warned not to linger near its doors after sunset. Parishioners crossed themselves twice when entering, once for God, once for protection against what dwelt below, and yet the very absence of evidence only fueled the fascination. The more the clergy denied the stories, the more the district believed them. Silence became complicity, records became erasure. Then came 1745, and with it, a revelation impossible to ignore. A set of maps from that year, drawn during renovations, revealed passages branching beneath the altar, passages absent from any later blueprint. These corridors, narrow and angular, seemed to lead nowhere, terminating in sealed walls. Builders at the time recorded them as redundant structures and closed them off, their purpose dismissed. Yet the decision to erase them from subsequent plans feels less like efficiency and more like concealment. Why would a church striving to embody transparency and faith scrub away the memory of rooms it once built? Some argued these passages were remnants of older construction, tunnels predating the church, perhaps linked top-leg burials. Others whispered they were designed intentionally, chambers not meant for human passage but for containment. Priests of the 18th century, more fearful of Enlightenment skepticism than of demons, may have chosen erasure over explanation. For what could be more dangerous to faith than the admission that darkness still lingered beneath the altar? The folklore only deepened with time. Tales circulated of bells tolling by themselves, of drafts that carried whispers from cracks in the stone, of candles extinguishing in unison during prayer. The vaults, whether real or imagined, became symbols of the uneasy marriage between the sacred and the profane. Were they architectural accidents or deliberate cages? Were they abandoned chambers of storage, or eternal prisons where voices still chanted in languages older than Scripture? What unsettles most is the absence of closure. History offers silence, legends offer terror, and neither reconciles with the other. Was St. James built in plague pits simply as a practical matter, land reclaimed, sanctified, recycled for holy use? Or was the choice deliberate, an attempt to cover over what should never be unearthed? The vault's origins resist clarity, as though the stones themselves conspire to hold their tongue. The section ends where the mystery sharpens. Those 1745 maps, drawn by hands long buried, showing passages later erased as if they never existed. Official records deny them, but ink on parchment insists they were real. Faith tells us God builds his house on rock. Folklore whispers that St. James built its foundation on bones and locked something beneath that never should have been awakened. By the middle of the 18th century, London was changing. Coffee houses thrived, pamphlets spread radical new philosophies, and voices of the Enlightenment rang across the city like bells calling people out of superstition into reason. Yet amid this new dawn of rationality, the parish of St. James remained burdened with shadows. The church itself stood tall and proud, its stained glass catching the pale light of winter mornings. But for those who entered, beauty was offset by unease. It was no longer merely a place of worship. It was becoming a mystery in stone, a battleground where faith and doubt wrestled in uneasy silence. The first whispers began with children. During Mass, while their parents bowed in prayer, Small hands tugged at sleeves and frightened eyes darted toward the floorboards beneath the pews. They claimed they heard crying, not the ordinary whimper of restless infants, but low, mournful sobbing that seemed to drift upward through the cracks of stone. Some said it was the weeping of women, others the cries of lost children themselves. At first, parents scolded them, dismissing such fears as boredom or imagination. But the persistence of the stories spread. Week after week, the same accounts emerged, sometimes from children too young to know each other, too young to conspire. Whose voices were they hearing beneath the altar? The unsettling tales did not remain confined to children's mouths. In 1753, a noble family, patrons of the church who had funded renovations of its choir stalls, suddenly abandoned their pews. No formal explanation was given, but neighbors whispered that during one evening service, their youngest daughter had fainted, overcome by what she described as a hand reaching up from beneath the floor. Servants claimed the family returned home pale and trembling. Ordering their belongings moved within days. They never entered St. James again. For a church that thrived on the support of wealthy patrons, the loss was noticed. The silence surrounding it was noticed even more. The preacher of Thatera, Reverend Samuel Whitcomb, was a man schooled in theology yet troubled by what he witnessed. His surviving journals, though carefully guarded, contain lines that offer glimpses into his unease. One passage reads, "During Vespers, the odor returned again, metallic, rusted, as though from blood left too long in the sun. The brethren dismissed it as damp stone, but I cannot rest with such explanations. The smell rises from beneath, from where no door should lead." Whitcomb's words are neither hysterical nor sensational. They are measured, precise, and all the more chilling for it. He was a man of God, sworn to uphold reason within faith, yet even he could not entirely dismiss what his senses told him. Others in the parish attempted to explain away the oddities. Rationalists of the time, emboldened by Enlightenment philosophy, argued that the church was suffering from poor sanitation. Moisture seeping through the old plague pits produced odors. Trapped air currents created illusions of voices. One pamphleteer, mocking the tales, wrote that, "A draft beneath the pews is mistaken for demons by those who know too little of science and too much of Scripture." Such explanations were logical, perhaps even comforting. Yet they did not account for the consistency of the accounts, nor the fear etched into the faces of those who left the church unable to return. Folklore, on the other hand, grew fat on the very doubts rationalists scorned. Locals whispered that the vaults below St. James were prisons, not for criminals, but for spirits too corrupted to be allowed release. Some believed priests of centuries past had trapped demons there, remnants of plague-haunted nights when exorcisms were whispered over mass graves. Others claimed it was not demons at all, but the unquiet souls of the plague dead, restless because they had been denied proper burial rites. Their bodies had been lowered without ceremony, without prayers, without peace. Their anger seeped upward, a reminder that the ground beneath the church was never truly sanctified. This clash, reason against belief, science against superstition, turned St. James into a theater of cultural conflict. For the Enlightenment mind, the church was a relic of an outdated worldview, a monument to irrational fear. For the faithful, it became something far more dangerous, proof that beneath reason lurked truths too terrible to face. Was the smell of rust and blood merely mildew and decay, or was it a sign, a warning that what had been buried refused to stay hidden? One incident in 1767 sharpened the divide. During a winter service, multiple parishioners reported hearing a sudden knocking beneath the altar, 3 sharp strikes that reverberated through the nave. The preacher halted mid-sermon. The congregation froze. Some later swore they saw the floorboards quiver as though struck from below. Rationalists argued it was the wood contracting from cold. Believers whispered it was the hand of the imprisoned dead. The event made its way into newspapers, ridiculed by some, magnified by others, and by the end of the year, St. James had acquired a reputation it could never shed. It was no longer simply a parish church. It was a mystery to be solved, or a nightmare to be endured. The noble families who once sought honor indonating to the church grew wary. Endowments slowed. Servants avoided working late at night within its walls. Yet the poor, the desperate, and the devout continued to fill its pews, torn between the promise of salvation above and the threat of damnation below. That duality, light versus shadow, faith versus fear, was woven into every sermon, whether spoken or unspoken. The vaults beneath the church, real or imagined, had become a presence more powerful than the sermons preached from the pulpit. By the close of the 18th century, the whispers had spread beyond the parish. Folklorists traveling through London recorded the tales, adding them to collections of English ghost stories. Travelers carried the legends to neighboring towns, embellishing them with each retelling. Some said the vaults held relics of forbidden rituals. Others claimed priests had sacrificed innocents during the plague years, burying not only bodies but guilt. Rationalists pushed back, publishing essays mocking the credulity of the common folk, yet the very need to refute the tales showed their growing hold. The more skeptics argued, the more believers clung, and so the vaults of St. James became more than architecture. They became a mirror reflecting society's greatest conflict. On one side stood reason, armed with science, determined to banish ghosts with the light of knowledge. On the other stood faith, heavy with centuries of ritual, convinced that some truths could never be reduced to air currents and damp stone. In between stood the people of the parish, caught in a web of fear, hope, and doubt, each step into the church both a prayer and a risk. The first whispers of the forbidden were not in the end, only about sounds or smells. They were about the unsettling possibility that the world of the Enlightenment, the world of reason, progress, and human mastery, was incomplete. That beneath the surface of London's most rational age, something older and darker persisted, untouched by logic, immune to philosophy. Perhaps the vaults beneath St. James were nothing more than sealed rooms filled with stagnant air. Or perhaps they were exactly what the stories claimed, a prison for voices that had never stopped weeping. The Enlightenment demanded answers. The vaults offered only silence, and silence, as history shows, is the most haunting sound of all. By the dawn of the 19th century, London was marching proudly into what many called the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment had left its mark, and the Industrial Revolution pushed forward with steam engines, railways, and factories that reshaped the city into a modern giant. Gas lamps illuminated streets that once drowned in darkness. Medical journals spread discoveries about anatomy and disease, and societies for scientific advancement gathered weekly to announce new theories. To the rational mind, mysteries were meant to be solved, not worshipped. Yet beneath this confident march of progress lay places where shadows refused to yield, where whispers from the past could not be silenced by the bright voice of reason. St. James Church was one such place, its vault still lingering in rumor, its name still spoken with unease in taverns and parlor rooms alike. For all the advances of the century, the church remained a riddle, and riddles demanded investigation. The first serious attempt came in 1851, led not by official authorities but by a group of amateur archaeologists, enthusiasts fascinated by London's buried histories. The city was, after all, built on layers of the past, Roman ruins beneath medieval alleys, plague pits beneath thriving markets, forgotten chapels beneath public squares. To them, St. James was simply another site to be catalogued and explained. They petitioned the church for permission to study the vaults. The request was quietly denied, though whether by fear, pride, or secrecy was never clarified. Frustrated, they proceeded without sanction, sneaking into the crypt one cold December evening, armed with lanterns, chisels, and notebooks. What they reported afterward split London opinion down the middle. According to their account, they discovered a bricked passage sealed long ago, precisely where the old maps from the previous century had suggested. Breaking through the weak mortar, they entered a chamber that smelled of stagnant air and iron. Within minutes, however, their boots splashed into what they described as black water, thick, viscous, and foul-smelling, flooding the vault so entirely that exploration became impossible. One of the men dipped a stick into the liquid and claimed it clung like tar. Another swore he saw movement within the water, as though something alive stirred beneath the surface. Startled, they withdrew, resealed the wall, and emerged shaken into the night. Their official statement to a local antiquarian society framed the vault as a flooded chamber of no historical significance. But privately, their notes told a different story. Those notes, preserved in fragments, describe lantern light reflecting on ripples though none of them moved, and faint sounds like whispers echoing in the pitch-dark chamber. Physicians of the time, steeped in the growing prestige of medical science, scoffed at these accounts. They argued that the black water was nothing more than stagnant runoff mixed with decomposing organic matter from the plague pits. The odors of rust and blood described in earlier decades, they said, were simply gases released by rotting remains. As for the whispers, physicians insisted that damp air carried echoes in strange ways, producing illusions that frightened minds mistook for voices. Some even suggested that hallucinations were induced by breathing the foul vapors, a primitive form of carbon dioxide intoxication. In their view, The entire legend of the vaults was a case study in how superstition thrived when science was ignored. Yet while journals dismissed the supernatural, other stories whispered through the city told a more sinister tale. Survivors of alleged secret midnight rituals claimed the vaults were not empty chambers at all, but places of forbidden worship. According to their testimony, never published officially but repeated in private circles, hooded figures had been seen slipping into the church after midnight, carrying candles and books bound in black leather. Those brave or foolish enough to peer through cracks in the old stone doors described flames burning where no sanctioned mass was held, Latin prayers spoken backwards, and voice echoing in strange harmonies that no single throat could produce. Whether these were genuine rituals or the fevered inventions of rumor is impossible to prove. But in the tension between science and superstition, they gave fuel to the side unwilling to dismiss the church's darkness. The clash between logic and faith grew sharper in the public sphere. London newspapers, always hungry for sensational stories, occasionally printed reports of hauntings at St. James. These would be followed within days by scathing editorials from rationalist societies, accusing editors of pandering to ignorance. The public found itself torn. On one hand, the thrill of the mysterious drew readers eagerly to every account. On the other, the pressure to appear modern and rational demanded skepticism. In parlors and pubs, debates raged. Was St. James a relic of medieval fear, or a genuine gateway to something unexplained? Into this atmosphere stepped Dr. Jonathan Hale, a respected physician and outspoken critic of superstition. Hale was a man of science in the truest 19th century sense, sharp, skeptical, and deeply confident that every mystery had a rational cause waiting to be discovered. In 1863, had delivered a lecture mocking the tales of St. James, calling them the desperate clinging of an ignorant age to terrors banished by progress. He insisted the crying children heard were merely echoes of footsteps, the odors nothing but decay, the black water only rot and runoff. He even mocked those who whispered of rituals, declaring that priests chanting backwards were as absurd as a locomotive running in reverse. The lecture earned applause from his peers, laughter from students, and newspaper coverage that spread his ridicule across London. But what happened next is the reason Dr. Hale's name is remembered not in medical journals, but in folklore. 2 weeks after his public dismissal of the church's legends, Hale was found dead at the very steps of St. James. He had not entered the building. His body lay outside, as though he had collapsed while approaching. Witnesses reported no signs of violence, no wounds, no struggle. Yet his face was twisted in a mask of pure terror, his eyes wide open, his mouth stretched as if frozen mid-scream. Physicians who examined him attributed the death to a sudden seizure or apoplexy, a tragic coincidence for a man who had worked long hours under stress. But to those who remembered his scornful words, the meaning was clear. Hale had mocked the vaults, and the vaults had claimed their revenge. The city buzzed with speculation. Rationalists scrambled to defend their ground, insisting death came for all men, regardless of their beliefs. Superstitious minds whispered that Hale had seen something on those steps, something too awful for the heart to endure. The more cautious simply shook their heads and avoided the subject, unwilling to declare allegiance to reason or fear. What none could deny was the uncanny timing. A man who had made public sport of mocking St. James had died in its shadow, his features carved into terror. Coincidence or consequence? The question haunted London. After Hale's death, investigations into vaults grew sporadic. Few dared to probe further, though whispers never ceased. Some claimed that on foggy nights, faint lights could be seen glowing beneath the church, as though candles burned in sealed rooms. Others insisted that if you stood near the altar and pressed your ear to the stone, you could still hear murmurs, low, steady, and distinctly human. Yet speaking words no one could understand. Each claim was countered by rational explanations, reflections of carriage lamps, the sound of water in underground channels, the tricks of imagination. Yet each explanation left behind a residue of doubt. The 19th century wore on, and London's hunger for scientific certainty only deepened. Yet St. James remained an anomaly, a blemish on the city's confident narrative of progress. It was a place where the rational mind confronted the limits of its explanations, where even the most skeptical were forced to admit that not every story could be neatly resolved. Science offered answers, but superstition offered meaning, and in the human heart, meaning often carried greater weight than reason. Thus, the vaults of St. James became more than a local legend. They became a symbol of the eternal struggle between knowledge and mystery. Rationalists would forever cite it as proof of human folly, while believers would point to Hale's death and the whispers in the dark as evidence that some truths lie beyond comprehension. The church stood silent, its stones neither confirming nor denying, leaving each generation to wrestle with the same question. Was St. James a monument to reason's triumph over ignorance, or a reminder that shadows cannot be banished so easily? Perhaps the answer was both. Perhaps science explained themkinisms while superstition preserved the awe. Or perhaps, as some feared in hushed voices, the vaults were exactly what they seemed, a place where reason faltered, and the impossible still walked in silence. The history of St. James Church is not written in official records alone. Its true story, if one can call it that, lives in the trembling words of those who claim to have seen, heard, or felt something that defied reason. While skeptics dismiss these accounts as hallucinations or hysteria, the sheer consistency across generations creates a tapestry of fear too intricate to ignore. These testimonies scattered through centuries form a shadow archive, a record not of stone and paper but of memory, trauma, and whispered confession. The question remains, did these men and women witness something real, or did they project their deepest fears onto the cold silence of the vaults? The earliest known account emerged in 1784, decades after the church's construction. A parish clerk named Thomas Hensley wrote in a private journal that while preparing the altar late one evening, he heard what sounded like weeping beneath the floor. Believing it to be his imagination, he ignored it until the sound shifted, forming what he swore were words. "Help us," he wrote, describing the voice as thin and hollow, as if spoken through water. Hensley never repeated this story aloud, fearing mockery, but after his death the journal passed into his family's possession. Generations later, the entry was cited by folklorists as the first testimony of voices from below. By the mid-1700s and early 1800s, more such stories surfaced. Children claimed to hear cries while attending Mass. Farmers passing the church at night described faint music drifting through the shutters, hymns sung in harmonies not found in any hymn book. And then there was the infamous account of the noble family who abandoned their pew. They had been benefactors of the church, their crest carved into one of its side walls. Yet after one Sunday in 1793 they never returned. Servants whispered that the family matriarch fainted during service, claiming to see pale hands reaching up through the stone floor, clawing at her skirts. Whether this was hysteria or vision, the family left St. James forever, their pew left to gather dust. The testimonies only grew stranger. In 1851, a hunter named Edward Blackwell claimed he stumbled upon Awagan Wheel while stalking deer near a bog 2 miles from the church. The wheel was ancient, half-rotten, yet it bore etchings eerily similar to the carvings on St. James's altar. More disturbingly, Blackwell described deep gouges along its rim, marks resembling claws, not tools. He dragged the relic to a nearby tavern, where witnesses confirmed its strange appearance, but by morning it had vanished. Some said thieves stole it. Others whispered that it sank back into the bog, reclaimed by whatever forces had hidden it for so long. Another testimony came from Mary Collins, the widow of a preacher. In 1867, she swore before neighbors that while walking home from evening prayers, she glanced through the nave windows and saw children standing barefoot near the altar. They were pale, their hair hanging in wet strands, their eyes unfocused. They sang a hymn she could not recognize, its melody unnervingly sweet, its words impossible to record. When she returned with others, the church was empty. Rationalists dismissed her vision as grief-induced delirium. Her husband had died only weeks earlier. Yet her description of the hymn, the strange cadence, the language no one recognized, echoes eerily in later testimonies. Not all accounts came from parishioners. By the late 19th century, paranormal societies emerged across England, blending Victorian curiosity with Gothic fascination. St. James inevitably drew their attention. One group, calling themselves the Society for Psychical Inquiry, conducted midnight vigils in the churchyard in 1882. They reported nothing unusual until their final night, when one member claimed to hear his mother's voice calling from beneath the ground. He rushed toward the sealed vault doors, convinced she was alive inside. Only the intervention of fellow members prevented him from breaking through the masonry with his bare hands. Later, he admitted his mother had been dead for 15 years. This phenomenon, later dubbed the mimic voices, became one of the most disturbing elements of the legend. Over decades, countless individuals swore to hearing loved ones calling them from within the church. Sometimes it was a spouse, sometimes a child, sometimes a parent long gone. The voices were never menacing. They were familiar, intimate, impossible to ignore. And always they seemed to draw listeners toward the sealed vaults. Skeptics argued that the power of suggestion created auditory hallucinations, especially in such an emotionally charged setting. Yet believers pointed out that the voices were often so specific, speaking in private tones, recalling long-forgotten words, that coincidence seemed unlikely. Psychologists of the era attempted to explain these accounts. Some argued they were projections of grief, a desperate attempt by the bereaved to maintain connection with the dead. The church, with its heavy air and history of plague burials, provided the perfect stage for such hallucinations. Others suggested mass hysteria, contagious suggestion passed through generations. But even the most rational minds admitted unease at the consistency of the reports. Could dozens of unrelated individuals across centuries all hallucinate the same pale children, the same mimic voices, the same inexplicable hymns? One of the most chilling accounts came not from a villager or widow, but from a soldier. In 1916, during World War I, a young man named Corporal William Price returned on leave to his family near St. James. One night, wandering near the churchyard, he claimed he heard the voice of his brother Henry calling from inside. Henry had died weeks earlier on the battlefield. Convinced it was a trick of memory, William nevertheless approached the vault doors. He described feeling a cold draft against his face, though the stones were sealed. Heswar the voice repeated his name 3 times, softer each time until silence swallowed it. Price later confided that if the doors had been open, he would have followed the voice without hesitation. Such testimonies blur the line between trauma and haunting. Was Price simply haunted by grief, his mind conjuring Henry's voice out of longing and guilt? Or was there something beneath St. James capable of mimicking the dead with such precision that even hardened soldiers believed it? These are the questions that fuel the debate: psychology versus haunting, projection versus truth. The 20th century brought new layers of testimony. In the 1960s, when London experienced a wave of interest in paranormal tourism, St. James became a hotspot for ghost hunters. Tape recorders placed near the altar captured faint murmurs, indistinct words, yet unmistakably human in cadence. Some claimed these were nothing more than background noise, interference, or the shuffle of feet on stone. Yet when analyzed, the recordings revealed pitches and tones overlapping in ways unnatural for a single voice. One investigator described it as a choir trying to sing in reverse. More disturbing still were the testimonies of those who stayed overnight inside the church. A handful of paranormal investigators reported waking to the sensation of being watched. One man, James Harland, claimed he awoke to find a child standing at the end of the pew, staring at him with unblinking eyes. When he lit his lantern, the child vanished. Another investigator described hearing footsteps pacing the aisles, though he was alone. A third, more skeptical member of the group insisted these were tricks of exhaustion, fear, and overactive imagination. Yet even he admitted that when they left the church at dawn, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though leaving a place that did not want us there. Through all these accounts, one theme emerges: consistency. Whether spoken by parish clerks in the 1700s, widows in the 1800s, soldiers in the 1900s, or investigators in the modern day, the stories share uncanny similarities. Pale children singing unknown hymns, voices of the dead calling from beneath the floor, flickers of light in sealed vaults. Skeptics cannot dismiss such parallels easily, though they continue to argue for psychological explanations. Believers, meanwhile, see the repetition as proof of something genuine, an echo of a truth buried too deep for reason to silence. Ultimately, eyewitness testimonies of St. James serve less as evidence and more as mirrors. They reflect not only the fears of those who uttered them, but also the enduring mystery of the human condition. Are these visions the product of grief, imagination, and cultural expectation? Or are they glimpses into a reality science cannot measure? The answer depends not only on evidence but on what each listener chooses to believe. For in the end, every testimony, whether of mimic voices, pale children, or claw-marked relics, forces us to confront a chilling possibility: that beneath St. James lies a truth so disturbing, it uses the voices of the dead themselves to call us closer. When the clergy of St. James fell silent, when the records conveniently thinned into blank spaces, and when the stone vaults beneath the altar were left locked for centuries, speculation rushed in to fill the void. People cannot abide silence when the setting itself demands answers. A church built over plague pits, a sanctuary where whispers claim to hear the voices of the dead, and a clergy that neither confirmed nor denied the rumors. This combination birthed a century-spanning archive of theories. Each theory says as much about the culture that produced it as it does about the supposed mysteries beneath the church. The most enduring theory among rational historians is also the most pragmatic, that the vaults were never intended as chambers of ritual, curse, or mystery at all. Instead, they were merely storage and burial crypts, their purpose magnified into legend by centuries of gossip. Yet this theory fails to satisfy those who ask the simplest question. If they were ordinary crypts, why lock them so tightly? Why erase them from later blueprints? And why maintain the silence for centuries? Even skeptics are forced to admit that secrecy itself fuels suspicion, and St. James's silence was thunderous. Another theory, far darker, casts the vaults not as storage but as prison. According to this belief, St. James was complicit in housing political prisoners during England's periods of upheaval in the 17th and 18th centuries. At a time when religious and political lines blurred, when a sermon could be as threatening as a pamphlet, critics of the crown and of the church alike may have been sealed below in silence. Their names vanished from records, their bodies buried not in earth, but in stone. The theory gained traction in the mid-19th century when whispers circulated of skeletons discovered in chained positions beneath other London churches. None were ever proven to have come from St. James, but the parallel was enough to ignite imaginations. Was the chanting beneath the altar the echoes of prisoners forced to pray? Was the crying the voices of those buried alive in punishment? Linked to this theory is one even more grotesque: that plague victims were sealed alive in the vaults, entombed to contain disease. During outbreaks, the desperate sought desperate solutions. Some historians believe communities were willing to suffocate the infected rather than risk contagion. Could the weeping beneath the church floor have been the dying gasps of the quarantined? Rationalists argue this explains both the crying children and the mimic voices, sound memory carried down as folklore from tales of plague pits. Yet this explanation raises another question. If such atrocities were real, why erase the vaults from official records? Why not sanctify them as places of sacrifice, bravery, or grim necessity? The erasure itself seems a confession. Folklorists, of course, spin the vaults into darker legends still. In the subversions, priests are not passive jailers, but active feeders of the vaults. The whispers say they offered sacrifices, not unwilling heretics or plague victims, but chosen souls, given to forces that dwelled beneath the stone. Children, left at the church steps, criminals delivered under cover of darkness, even wayward parishioners accused of sins beyond confession, all fed to the hollow hunger of the vaults. This legend, while sensational, took root in the popular imagination. Broadsheets in the 1800s printed lurid tales of priests chanting in reversed Latin, of doors opening downward into endless tunnels, of parishioners disappearing after midnight masses. These stories blurred fact and myth, yet the mere possibility that men of God could perform such deeds ensured their survival. Rationalists counter these tales with equal fervor, accusing locals of fabricating stories to mask crimes or to attract attention. In this reading, the mimic voices were nothing but echoes, the pale children hallucinations, the claw-marked relics deliberate hoaxes. Human imagination, they argue, can transform moldy air and candlelight into apparitions. To them, the real mystery is not what lies beneath St. James, but why generations chose to embellish it. Was it fear of plague, or resentment toward the clergy, or simple delighting ghost stories? The rationalists insist that folklore thrives where trauma festers, and that St. James was simply fertile ground for invention, and yet, the folklore refuses to die. Even as science advanced, even as rational explanations proliferated, the legend of the vaults endured. In the 20th century, ghost tours in London seized upon the mystery, guiding tourists past St. James, at night while recounting tales of mimic voices and barefoot children singing hymns. Documentaries followed, some earnest investigations, others gleeful exploitations. Paranormal forums today are filled with grainy photographs of shadows in the church windows, with claims of recordings capturing ghostly hymns. One viral post in the early 2000s featured audio said to be taken from beneath the altar, a chorus of voices, layered and discordant, breaking suddenly into silence. Experts debunked it as audio manipulation, yet the legend only grew. In modern culture, The vaults of St. James have become more than a local curiosity. They are a symbol of unresolved mystery, a touchstone for debates between belief and skepticism. For believers, the persistence of the stories proves their truth. For skeptics, it demonstrates only the persistence of human imagination. Both sides, however, are united in fascination. The church has become a stage where psychology, folklore, and theology act out their eternal debate. Perhaps the sharpest clue lies not in what has been said about the vaults, but in what has not. Despite centuries of rumors, despite ghost tours and documentaries, despite persistent requests from historians and archaeologists, the church has never unsealed the vaults. Why? If nothing lies below, if the chambers are empty or flooded or mundane, why not dispel the myths by revealing them? This refusal creates the most haunting theory of all, that silence itself is an answer, that some truths are too dangerous to see daylight. In the end, the cultural legacy of the St. James vaults is not about priests or prisoners or plague victims. It is about us, the living, who demand explanations for the inexplicable, who cannot abide the thought of unanswered questions. The vaults have become a mirror, reflecting our fears of death, our suspicion of authority, our hunger for stories that transcend reason. They stand as both warning and invitation, a sealed door beneath an altar, daring us to open it, taunting us with silence. And so, the mystery persists. Was it tragedy, cover-up, or legend? Were the cries beneath the pews the final breaths of the dying, or echoes planted in imagination by centuries of retelling? Did priests serve God, or something darker? The vaults will not say. The church will not unseal them, and until it does, we are left only with whispers, theories, and the heavy silence of stone. The forbidden vaults of St. James Church endure not simply as locked chambers beneath an ancient altar, but as a paradox of silence and noise, silent in their stone, yet deafening in rumor, speculation, and fear. For centuries, the doors have remained shut, the air around them thick with unanswered questions. Records vanish where they should exist. Testimonies contradict one another. Science tries to explain but never fully succeeds, and folklore eagerly fills the void with whispers of demons, forgotten prisoners, and relics too dangerous for mortal eyes. The vaults have become less a physical place than a reflection of humanity's eternal obsession with mystery, a mirror where faith and doubt, reason and superstition, good and evil, all confront one another in shifting forms. The floor above them may appear polished, ordinary, sacred even, but the stories remind us that beneath every sanctuary lies the possibility of darkness. To some, the vaults are nothing but empty chambers of damp stone. Rationalists argue that what people mistake for supernatural occurrences are merely echoes, drafts, or the fevered imaginations of those too willing to see phantoms where none exist. They insist that history is written not in whispers, but in records, and that the absence of documented evidence speaks louder than folklore. Yet this explanation, neat and reasonable as it may sound, does little to still the unease that coils around St. James. The silence of stone can be more terrifying than screams, and emptiness itself can be a kind of haunting. Others refuse to accept such simplicity. They believe the vaults were built not to store coffins or relics, but to contain something that should never have been set free. Some say plague victims were sealed alive to prevent contamination, their final cries echoing through the years as ghostly hymns. Others argue that political prisoners or heretics were hidden away, erased from history by clerical decree. And still darker tales claim that priests themselves fed the vaults with sacrifices, rituals cloaked in the language of faith, but devoted to something far older, far more merciless, than Christianity. If these are only legends, they are legends that refuse to die. The church, however, will not yield. Requests to excavate, investigate, or even survey the sealed passages are denied. Blueprints that once acknowledged the chambers have been erased from official archives. The clergy dismiss questions with polite but immovable certainty. There is nothing there. Yet denial itself has become the strongest fuel for curiosity. If truly there is nothing, why such resistance to prove it? Why let shadows stretch further, when light could banish them with a single gesture? Some believe this secrecy is an act of protection, that priests centuries ago made a pact of silence to keep evil confined. Others fear the opposite, that the evil was never beneath but above, that the priests themselves were its architects. And so, the story circles back to where it began, the sealed stone floor beneath St. James, unbroken, untouched, and undefeated by time. The vaults remain closed, their secrets unspoken. Tourists pass the church at night, pausing to wonder. Historians argue, believers pray, skeptics scoff, but none can silence the question that endures like a heartbeat in the walls. What lies beneath the altar? Perhaps it is nothing, perhaps it is everything. Until the vaults open, or until they swallow their mystery forever, the silence remains, daring us to listen.